Hey everyone, welcome back to RM Transit. If you're new here, my name is Reece and I talk about public transit. At least that's what it's called here in Canada and the US for the most part. In other parts of the world that might be called public transport or public transportation or something else. Today we are really going back to basics. We're talking about why frequency is fundamental to good transit and how that's so often forgotten. Let's dive in. If you're watching this, chances are you may not be subscribed, so seriously consider doing it because it really helps the channel. If you are subscribed, chances are you haven't hit the bell icon, so again, consider doing so because it really does help us keep the lights on. You're probably wondering why I'm making such a simple video, because of course the frequency of transit, literally just how often a bus or train comes, is fundamental to it being good. But looking back, I realized I never made a video just about why frequency is good. I've made videos on all kinds of related topics to frequency, but not the most obvious question. This sort of seems like the type of thing I should make a video about. But if you have any other basic transit stuff you think I should make a video about, let me know in the comments down below and I'll try to make those videos as well. The first thing I'll do as always is bring up some examples. Something you'll notice is that most of the well-used transit out there is frequent. Though, of course, what frequent is really does depend on the context. Every 10 minutes isn't really good for a subway line, but it's pretty good for an intercity train or for a bus. Now, as it turns out, the fact that these frequent services are the most used isn't by accident. Even if transit use was really sporadic, unless there's literally no unmet travel demand, more seats is always going to give you more potential to gain riders. Even if only because transit, which is not super full, is incredibly comfortable to use. You see, if you run a bus or a train line once per hour, you have a certain number of seats. But if you upgrade that to every 15 minutes, you have 4 times as many. A train or bus every 5 minutes is going to triple that new number once again. Of course, frequent transit actually needs the capacity that's delivered through its frequency, because as transit planning celebrity Jarrett Walker puts it in his very famous book, Human Transit, frequency is freedom. And this is the most salient description of why frequency is good that I think exists out there, at least on the basic level. Frequent transit lets you travel whenever you want to travel, which all compelling modes of transportation, be it walking, cycling, or yes, even driving a car, all allow you to do. Now, car analogies will always be somewhat controversial in the transit space, but around the world, cars are one of the main things competing with transit, and so I think it's worth doing some comparisons to at least see what we can learn from what makes cars popular. Now, as much as transit people like me do sometimes push back on this, it is absolutely true that being able to get into a car and go wherever you want, whenever you want, is a hugely powerful thing, even if just psychologically. Cars have tons of negative aspects that transit doesn't have, but just the benefit of feeling like I can go whenever I choose, even if it's at 3 a.m., is really impactful. Now, as I sort of alluded to before, lower frequencies on transit can sort of be accepted on longer trips, and the reason for this can be explained through this sort of toy example. Imagine taking a short trip from your home to like a suburban shopping mall or something like that on a bus that runs really infrequently, let's say every hour, which is sadly all too common in North America. Given that buses, even those with dedicated lanes, often have lower average speeds than cars because they do have to make stops for people to get on and off, it's going to be basically impossible for that hourly bus to compete on travel time alone with a car. In fact, you could possibly drive to a mall and back in the time you might end up waiting for that bus, and I think people are well aware of that when they see an hourly bus service. Of course, driving may still well be faster even if the buses run every 10 or 15 minutes, but the gap is a lot smaller. And that's where the benefits of a bus that a car just cannot compete with, like being able to take a nap, or go on your phone, or just not focus on doing an active task the entire time, really starts to compete with the allure of actually driving. There's also a very powerful psychological effect of just sitting at a station or transit stop while other vehicles drive by you. Time spent sitting still just feels unproductive, more so than even riding on a vehicle that's going really slowly, because then at least you're still making progress. Of course, making longer trips in a city with infrequent transit gets even more painful. Of course, transit networks based around transfers are way more useful generally than transit networks that are based on a lot of one-seat rides, because you can transfer from one line to another to go almost anywhere relatively quickly. That said, transfer-based networks actually become worse than one-seat ride-based networks once you start having really poor frequencies, because the only thing worse than waiting for your bus for maybe 30 or 40 minutes is having to do so twice. This punishes people who use transit and makes sure that nobody privileged enough to have another option will actually use it. And I think honestly that's a large part of what causes transit to be stigmatized in certain places. There's a positive side to this as well though. As you can see with system after system that has increased their service, ridership tends to follow very closely. Because once transit becomes competitive and convenient, taken as a whole, it becomes way more popular. Cars are never going to be able to compete on things like price. At the same time, you're probably going to need the capacity that frequency delivers. Because unlike with just having bigger vehicles, like let's say a double-decker bus or a train that's just twice as long, when you add frequency, you actually improve the level of service of transit, which means you make the quality of transit better. That's why it's really important to focus on building capacity through frequency first, because you get all of those upfront benefits of making transit better that you wouldn't get with just having a bigger train that still comes in frequently. And of course, much like the pain of transferring is amplified the number of times you have to transfer, the benefits of really frequent transit are amplified over trips that have more and more transfers, since you can conveniently transfer when your next vehicle is only a few minutes away. The TLDR of this is that nobody wants inconvenient or infrequent transit. These things do come together. And when you don't have those things, transit tends to become popular and you need more capacity. Because honestly, as long as your transit runs often, it's going to start being pretty competitive with driving, even if it's slower. Now, one of the deceptive things about frequency is, as I mentioned before, it reduces your need for gigantic vehicles. And this can really distort the dynamics around what people think is appropriate. In the United States, a lot of subway systems have trains that are 120 meters long or longer, and yes, I'm going to use metric. Come on. But these trains tend to run fairly infrequently. And what's interesting is that the ridership you see on these lines tends to be similar to what you see on smaller lines in places like Vancouver or Madrid. And so it can be tempting, and I have fallen into this trap before, to suggest that you could simply build Canada Line style mini metros in places like Washington, DC, because they would satiate all the demand. The issue with this is that it doesn't account for the massive ridership uplift you're going to see when you start running trains way more frequently. Now, that's not to say you couldn't make trains in a lot of American cities a lot smaller and be totally fine, but there's a reason why cities like London and Paris still tend to use trains around 100 meters long, especially on newer lines. Of course, if you're building above ground, this matters even less because your prices are less impacted by having larger or smaller trains. Now, there's probably a PhD to be done somewhere talking about where the limit of more frequent transit becoming more popular is, but we don't really know as far as I can tell. We know that there's a floor where people will accept transit as frequent of about every 10 to 15 minutes, but it's not clear just how frequent becomes frequent enough. When you talk to people in cities where trains run every 90 or 100 seconds on metro lines, they tend to be really happy that they can just wait if the train is crowded and get on the next one. Of course, there have long been limits to frequency, not only because of one of the commonly stated factors, which is labor, but also because we didn't really know how to design stuff in the optimal way to make frequency possible. We actually have historically had systems that operate super frequently on things like older subways and streetcar networks. Where we've really innovated is being able to make them much faster and safer while still being frequent. At the same time, it's easy to fall into the trap, whether it be for buses or trains, that if we just automated everything, that would make transit good immediately. But that line of thought is sort of like a transit system with insufficient funding, assuming that if it just sells naming rights to its station, that it will be able to operate a better transit service. Sure, it might help generate a little bit of money, and that's okay to a reasonable extent, though I'm not sure whether McDonald's station is considered reasonable by you. But the amount of money you're going to need to run more frequent transit is frankly just an order of magnitude more than you'll save by automating or by doing wacky things like naming your stations after companies. That's because while driving trains and buses is a major component of the cost of operating them, we still need a lot of people to do things like planning service and actually doing maintenance on vehicles. That means automation is a great tool for places that already have good transit and want to make it better, but it's probably not going to save any transit systems that aren't already committed. Transit more often is kind of the vegetables of mobility. It isn't that yummy, but it's what you need. Where still, big infrastructure can eat up a lot of money and funding from transit systems. If you're not willing to run buses frequently, why should anyone believe you're willing to run trains frequently? At the end of the day, this all comes back to the primacy of frequent service. Even here in Toronto, many people who own cars still choose to use transit, even though it isn't always time competitive. And that's because it's convenient, because it's frequent.